You're listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education institute making law work for people, places, and the planet. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support our work, consider donating at eli.org/donate.
Listeners, happy Earth Day and a warm welcome to another episode of People, Places, Planet. I'm your host, Sebastian Duque Rios, and today, on our 56th celebration of Earth Day, we're marking the special occasion with a landmark conversation featuring ELI President Jordan Diamond and Senior Attorney Jay Austin. From ELI's founding and the aftermath of the first Earth Day to its cutting-edge work on emerging issues, this episode traces the arc of environmental law from ELI's perspective, focusing on the growth and rebuilding that lays ahead. We'll also be digging into ELI's recent collaboration with the Federation of American Scientists, or FAS, on a major new paper examining the baseline and future of environmental governance. To get us started, could each of you briefly introduce yourselves?
Thank you, Sebastian, for not only being a fabulous host of today's episode, but for all of your work on this podcast generally. It is a pleasure to join you. I'm Jordan Diamond. I have the privilege of serving as the president of the Environmental Law Institute. I actually started my career here at ELI as a baby lawyer many years ago, and then left for a better part of a decade to lead a policy research center at UC Berkeley, and then returned to ELI a few years back. And if there's a through line to my career, it has been focusing on the intersection of evidence-based decision making. How do you incorporate science and other critical information into law and policy in accountable and transparent and inclusive ways?
Thanks, Sebastian, I'm a senior attorney at ELI. I've actually now been at ELI for well over half of ELI's 56 years. I've worked on a lot of different things in that time. One of the through lines of my career, though, has been water law, Clean Water Act, wetlands protection, ocean and coastal management. And increasingly, and in recent years, some expertise in the court system and environmental litigation and how it shapes our field of environmental law overall. And I guess I'm also a little bit of an environmental law historian just by virtue of having been here long enough to have remembered many of the things that happened that are now history.
Thank you both. And today's episode centers on Earth Day, a bit of a celebration as well as a reflection on what the day means. It's a day that honors the same realities and idealisms that gave rise to ELI and the landmark environmental laws of the 1970s. Can we briefly return to that moment? What was ELI founded to do, and how does that founding mission resonate or look different in 2026?
Absolutely. I think this is actually something I really love doing. So you guys have both already touched upon the fact that this is the 56th Earth Day, and ELI is also 56 years old. So the first Earth Day occurred a few months after ELI had filed its Articles of Incorporation. And back then, this was before we had a lot of our bedrock environmental laws. The idea was to have a clearinghouse for information about this growing, I can't entirely say nascent field because there was a lot of law on the books, just not a lot of what we think of as our bedrock laws today. But so this growing field of environmental law, could we have a centralized place to share information about it, commentary, provide education, really think about how this field was going to evolve so that you could kind of have these intentional dialogues about it. And you fast forward through the years over the past half century, in many ways, that mission has never changed. That mission of being a trusted place where you can get information about what's happening in this field, that's still very much our mission. But what that looks like in practice at any given moment, that will change depending on what's going on, right? Sometimes it's leaning into our support for candid, hard conversations. Sometimes it's about leaning into, we really need robust research on a particular topic. Sometimes it's about really bringing people together just to have thoughtful conversations about what comes next. So the question about where we lean at any given time, that really changes depending on where we are. And where we are is where our framework is, how our laws are doing, how our policies are doing, how our institutions are doing in delivering the basic foundational premise of the frameworks that are supposed to be protecting the resources around us. So I think in this moment in Earth Day 2026, we're really looking at our institutions and some of the rapid change that they have seen and some of the different approaches to our existing legal framework. That rapid rate of change and some of the kind of pivots that we've seen, we're really thinking about what does that mean for the challenges that are driving our work day to day, whether that is reducing pollution of our water and air, effectively addressing climate change and the challenges of tomorrow, whether you're looking at nutrient overload, biodiversity loss, pick your challenge and really thinking about what this massive institutional change and what the difference is in our governing frameworks. What is that going to mean long term for our goals on all those fronts? So, Jay, I'd love to hear your thoughts on ELI and our time.
It's a great question because just as ELIs, the birth of ELI is sort of tied up with these original foundational environmental statutes that came out of Earth Day. The organization sort of grown and evolved along with the statutes. And Earth Day is a perfect occasion to kind of reflect back on that era because I think in a lot of ways it bears reminding people just how far-sighted some of that work was. We like to talk about how we were born at the same time as NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. And the founders, they talked about writing a statute that would help create and maintain conditions under which man and nature can exist in productive harmony. You can almost hear the 1970s coming through there. NEPA has been in the news a lot lately in this very specific context of permitting reform and has undergone some of the first changes in its long history only in recent years. But I think the founders knew that it was primarily a cross-cutting statute designed to make for better decisions, designed to be information forcing and inform everything else that the government did using its substantive laws. So I think it's interesting to see how vital NEPA still is. I think that broader vision to keep in mind that information itself is generally going to be a good thing. The kind of evidence that ELI's work is based on will always be good. So the basic idea that more information informing government decision-making is better and allows citizens to participate in that decision-making, that's one worth hanging on to.
I think that's such an important point, and I think it really emphasizes the notion that environmental law is not static. It was never, I don't think, intended to be. There was never an idea that there's a one and done and we have the answer. It is a cyclical field like any other area of law where you're going to innovate and you're going to test and then you're going to have to figure out how to adapt. And we can really work on that and have responsive systems that incorporate new information so that they can just keep doing a better job getting to their goal.
I think that's right. The next example, the Clean Air Act, the first substantive environmental statute from that era, so much of the tension of what we see going on in implementing that now and trying to adapt it to the global crisis of climate change is asking that question. How much adaptive management was built into that statute to begin with? How foresighted were the drafters of that? And I still think there's a pretty strong case that they did foresee the unforeseens and build into the statute enough flexibility to adapt to crises like climate change that were not on the radar. There's a great recent interview with Tom Jorling in the New York Times at age 85, who was one of the original Senate staffers who worked on the act and who says that, at least to his mind at that time, they envisioned that the act would expand and adapt to those kind of challenges. And the language that they wrote was intended to encompass those. It's definitely true that we could always use better laws, better drafting, and things could always be improved on that front. But I also want to credit, again, that Earth Day generation with a vision for knowing that we would need to find ways to adapt to these challenges. And if anything, it may not be the text of the law that's changed so much as the way we're reading it or the frame, the challenges that people are bringing to it.
Getting back to your original question, Sebastian, of what was ELI founded to do and has that changed over the years? As I said at the beginning, I hope that our fundamental mission never changes. And I also think that the way that we do it, that's what kind of adapts over time. And right now, fostering conversation about what is the best way forward and what are some of the systemic solutions that we can integrate into our law and policy, to our regulatory systems, really bringing people together to have hard conversations about that. That's something that's really exciting to me and that I hope we can really dig into and further over the coming years.
Thank you both for sharing that really valuable long-term perspective on what ELI has sought out to do in its founding and what ELI continues to do today. I mean, I think as you pointed out, ELI has been watching these legal systems evolve for more than 50 years. And I'll just make a note to our listeners that at the end of last year, we covered some of these emerging trends that are reshaping environmental law on this podcast in our What's Next for Environmental Law in 2026 episode. So I'll encourage our listeners to take a listen if they're interested. But I want to move on to the fact that, what makes ELI distinctive is that it doesn't just analyze these trends. As you noted, Jordan, we're facilitating these conversations and we're working to shape what comes next and how we can have better laws and tackle the most urgent problems. Let's talk about what ELI is actually doing in response to the moment that we find ourselves in. One thing is that ELI is increasingly engaging with emerging technologies and industries like data centers, deep sea mining, geothermal, and nuclear energy. What is drawing ELI to some of this work?
I love this question, partially because it lets me show my true geek colors. So at the end of the day, if you're working kind of the law and policy realm, you have to be a little obsessed with process, right? You have to enjoy having conversations about process. And that for me is the heart of our work on emerging technologies and industries, as you say. Whether that is, I mean, you don't get much more different than deep sea mining versus data center build outs, right? These are incredibly different technologies, environments, et cetera. The common thread is how are we effectively making sure that our legal framework keeps pace with these innovations while also working on effective guardrails and mechanisms for making sure that we're maximizing their beneficial use. So that question of how do we make sure that law isn't chasing, but actually keeping pace with and evolving hand in hand with these technologies, that for me is really exciting because we know what happens when the cart gets in front of the horse, and we know what happens when the horse gets too far in ahead of the cart. We really want those to be working synergistically. And so our solutions there, they're nothing earth shattering. How do we bring the right people together to talk about, oh, how is this framework going to handle this new approach? It's about bringing people together. It's about looking at what's actually on the books. It's the same analysis of what do we have? What are we missing? What do we need to clarify?
And I agree with that. I think one of ELI's longstanding strengths has always been in the area of environmental governance, processes, and institutions. I mean, in some sense, that's what lawyers do or do best. That's our love language, right? But my own work particularly has been looking laterally to areas other than environmental law for the commonalities in administrative law. How do agencies work? How do regulations work? What are some of the same tools? What are some of the challenges to those tools that can also be applied to our field? So we certainly have that expertise in frameworks, as Jordan was saying, but I also want to pick up on her point about guardrails. We still view everything through the lens of environmental protection, that it's starting with the goal of not just minimizing, but ideally eliminating harm, making sure that solutions are equitable. Just because a technology is new and creates a regulatory vacuum that needs to be filled doesn't mean that all regulations are equally good. Some of the problems are old and well known. We know what nitrogen oxide emissions look like or greenhouse gas emissions look like, whether they're coming from conventional manufacturing or from data centers. We know what water consumption looks like, no matter the sources, and what some of the harms are to populations. So it's taking some of those old lessons and concerns and desire to mitigate or eliminate those harms and analogizing or applying them to the new situation and new technologies as they come along.
I think that's really true, right? How do you have kind of a holistic perspective when looking at these new frontiers? And also, I think inherent in the new frontiers question is we have a lot of really challenging, complex, interconnected problems to solve. And so, how do you make sure you continue using the proven solutions that we have while continuing to explore what else could also help? It doesn't have to be one or the other, it should always be both. And so, we have a lot of work within ELI that I think we refer to as the unsexy work that we love. It is the stuff that doesn't make headlines, it never will, but it's the stuff about actually like rolling up your sleeves and making sure that implementation is effective. Are you actually operationalizing these beautifully thought out systems? Okay, well, you design the system, then you have to actually implement it, right? Then the other half is really figuring out, okay, are there holes in the system and are there new things that we need to come up with?
Yeah, I really love this idea of ELI's task being to do the unsexy stuff as a love language to environmental law, right? It's beautifully put.
I've said this a number of times. Solving environmental challenges is not a short term game. When you think of really protecting ecosystems, really making sure that you have drinkable water, that doesn't happen overnight. You might be able to stop it from getting worse pretty quickly, but that actual restoration and recovery, that's long term work. And I will say, there's not a ton of room for ego in that work. So I think some of the people that I know that have been most effective in this space, these are not the headline names. These are the people who are just rolling up their sleeves and just getting it done day after day. I think that's true in most fields, but it's certainly true in ours where there just aren't a lot of short term turnarounds.
And I think that connects nicely to our next question, Jordan. I brought up the importance of this long perspective, especially I think with emerging technologies, right? Like we're not going to figure out the perfect solution right now. That's why we need adaptive management. We need to be able to anticipate some flexibility for the future. And it's also hard to focus on that long perspective when there's so much that's happening in the moment and on a daily basis. Environmental law practitioners right now are dealing with nearly daily onslaught of regulatory rollbacks, emergency procedures, and executive actions that are really just changing the playing field. And so, how is ELI balancing this long term research and capacity building with the need to respond to some of these issues in real time? What does that rapid response look like at an organization like ELI?
Sure. Rapid is not often a word used with ELI because we do think very long term about our sustainable solutions. ELI's job has never been to be the daily journalist. There are incredible journalists doing high quality work, and I am in awe of how quickly they can so comprehensively cover kind of day to day developments. ELI's work instead has been more about connecting the dots across disciplines, across developments, right? How do you show the connectivity and paint the picture that isn't necessarily going to be obvious to everyone right off the bat? What does that get us? That gets us the ability to have thoughtful and constructive dialogue where you can bring people together to share both the history and the arc of what this development means in context and tee up the conversation about what happens next. So it's not just about tracking what changes, but it's what changes. How does that change the arc of what we're trying to do in our regulatory systems? And how can we bring people together to really think about what should happen? And so I think that's where ELI's definition of rapid response ends up resting is what are the conversations that we should be helping create a safe space to have when there is a major change on one front or the other. Realistically, we are in a very polarized environment right now, and it can be challenging to create the space where people feel comfortable coming in an open and constructive manner to have those conversations. That is our magic. And I think that's what I hope we can continue to create more space for today, because that seems to be a shrinking space. And I think it's critical to our success in the future of environmental law.
I think that's right. I think that's always been a big piece of what ELI has done. But having spent most of my career in our research and policy division. I also want to put in a plug for the work that emanates from within ELI, the research work that we generate ourselves, which is funded over the years by both government and philanthropic sources to try to solve a specific problem and reach conclusions, recommendations, reforms about that area. My own area has been in the water protection field, but we've done work across the board. There's maybe a couple different dimensions to your question. One is, if you look around us in the here and now, there's no question there's all kinds of noise going on and distractions. There are literal fires as well as metaphorical ones that need to be put out. And there are legal groups that have always done that better than ELI, the litigation groups that are in the courts day to day, taking on some of those challenges. That's never been our role. Some of those groups go as far back to the founding as ELI does. And there are also more recent, younger groups that do it even better, or even more in the here and now. And our role in that arena, I think, is at least one, maybe two steps removed. It is very much looking at all the different dots and connecting them and trying to synthesize what the trends are and explain them to people, trying to help shed more light on the issues so that people in the trenches of whether it's litigation or legislation or regulation can do their work better. And I guess my gloss on that, I've often said, ELI is not going to give you the bumper sticker answer the next day, but we will hand you the 50-page heavily footnoted report 3 months from now, and it will represent our work, and it will hopefully be our own constructive, substantive contribution to the dialogue. But I also think, in your question, I think the timeline is getting compressed. I mean, the climate crisis is definitely putting pressure on the clock. I don't think we have the luxury necessarily of the same kind of long 50-year view that people did back in 1970. And ELI will have to adapt, and I think we're in the process.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both. And a good example of the kind of long-term thinking that ELI is best positioned to do to help other actors in the environmental space is our collaboration with the Federation of American Scientists that I alluded to earlier. So ELI has been collaborating with other institutions such as FAS on rebuilding and reimagining environmental governance. Would you both tell us a little bit more about this collaborative work with FAS?
We'd love to. This has been a really fun initiative. So FAS, as you mentioned, has been thinking about kind of the next evolution of our regulatory framework. So they launched a Center for Regulatory Ingenuity. And as part of that launch, they asked a variety of actors to publish white papers thinking about different aspects of our regulatory framework. And so Jay and myself and some of our colleagues here at ELI wrote a paper laying out what we see as some of today's challenges. So kind of the arc of environmental law over the past 50 years and what we see as some of the tensions today. So we wrote this paper and now we're looking at how do we use that as a launching point for further conversation as we think about, again, what are the tools that we've developed over the last 50 years that are effective and efficient, that work really well, and where are the gaps for what we're trying to achieve? Now, what are we trying to achieve is the $1 million question. That's probably an outdated metric, the $1 trillion question. At the end of the day, do we agree that the goals are clean water, clean air, right? In general, there's not a lot of disagreements there. It's once you get one level below that, how do you achieve them? And what is the relative prioritization? And what are the trade-offs that people are willing to make in order to achieve those goals? So that's what we're digging into this year and pulling people together from a variety of perspectives and backgrounds and areas of expertise to really be weighing in on these questions. Jay, I'd love to hear your take on it.
I think one thing that the paper contributes right out of the gate is trying to restore a holistic view of the environment, economy, and society. And as I tried to suggest earlier, I think that vision was there in the 70s as well. I think we got away from that because obviously things need to be implemented, professionalized. Permits need to be written over the decades for air and water and other things. And systems don't necessarily age in step with the times. So the paper, I think, is rightly calling for a reinstatement of that vision, trying to see what we can do in the here and now. And I agree with what Jordan was saying earlier. It's a both and. Obviously, if we could draw on a clean slate right now, if we could re-legislate and that were a realistic prospect in the near future, there are all sorts of things we'd like to write into the law. A revised Clean Air Act amendment that just says greenhouse gases are covered by the Clean Air Act and shall be regulated by EPA to mitigate climate change, full stop, to take a hypothetical example. Absent that, I think it is the both and of trying to figure out how to work with the tools we've been given, seeing what other arenas might have opened up in the absence, say, of overarching federal regulation, whether that's in state and local governments or the private sector or public-private collaborations. And I think the kind of cross-sectoral conversation that the paper and the upcoming conversations anticipate is the place to look right now.
I would love to take a moment to follow up on Jay's comment about the interconnections between environment, economy, and social well-being that we touched on in our recent discussion paper, because this is something that in the abstract seems so simple. And when you actually get down to implementation, when you actually think about what are the regulatory reforms that will better integrate our environmental, economic, and social development goals, it becomes very difficult. And so this is a space where I'm really excited to dig in and think about how can we make sure we move away from this idea that economy and environmental are diametrically opposed. It's a very complex relationship, and we have to figure out the ways where you can make progress on all fronts. So whether we call that triple bottom line, integrated sustainability, whatever name we give to this idea that you can't think of one in isolation, that has to inform every next step.
Well, thank you both so much for joining me today. It's been a rich conversation covering ELI's founding, the work happening right now, and some of the exciting collaboration with the Federation of American Scientists to build a durable, evidence-based framework for environmental governance fit for the 21st century. And I want to close on something that I think crystallizes everything that we've discussed. The paper that ELI and FAS produced concludes that the triple planetary crisis, the interconnected and simultaneous emergencies of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, is at its core a democratic and governance challenge, not just a scientific one, not just a technical one, but a question of whether our institutions, our laws, and our collective decision-making are up to the task. So, on Earth Day 2026, I want to ask both of you, what does that conclusion mean for you personally, and what gives you hope, or what do you see as the most important next step in rising to meet it?
I guess for me, what gives me hope is knowing that we not only know some of the tools and processes and the goals, but I feel like we already have some of the answers. To stick with my example of greenhouse gas emissions and the climate crisis, if you look globally at the speed at which the clean energy transition is happening, with or without us, I think there's cause for hope. I think you can also see that there is starting to be some alignment between environmental and economic and societal goals, in that market conditions and maybe even some of the recent geopolitical upheaval might push things along, albeit in a very chaotic way. It's not going to happen automatically, though. I mean, it's something that requires participation. That is why, as you say, it's a democratic and governance challenge. It's something that we need to make happen and need to fight for. But that is what keeps me getting up in the morning.
I really agree with that. I think the silver lining of the fact that these crises are democratic and governance challenges is that we have a lot of solutions available. Do we have all of them? I'm not sure. I don't have that clairvoyance, but do we have a lot of tools that we can use effectively? Absolutely. It's a complicated puzzle, but it's just about putting the pieces in the right place. And we can do that, right? It takes time and it takes effort, and you accidentally put the wrong pieces together and then you have to undo them. And I'm not a great puzzler, you might be able to tell. But then you do find those that fit together and you start to really kind of paint the picture. That is very hopeful. And you hear these success stories of just incredible things happening, right? Whether that's unlikely partners coming together or an innovative tool in a particular area, you hear these success stories and you realize the challenge is just about scale and managing to scale that humanity for the sake of everyone. I think that feels hopeful. One of the most promising things that I see day in and day out, the talent that we see coming through ELI. When we look at our research associates, we just get these amazing, motivated, dedicated, experienced people coming in to spend their first couple of years of their professional career with us and seeing all they are capable of, everything that you do, your insights, the cross-disciplinary perspective that you bring, that is something that I don't know anything that gives more hope than that. Not to say that we're dumping all the problems on you. I'm not trying to say that part, but it really is when you look ahead at people who are thinking with a truly integrated perspective on how do we move forward. It is truly inspiring. So just have to spend a moment giving a shout out to the incredible folks that we are lucky enough to get to work with.
Thank you, Jordan. That means a lot personally. And I think surely would also mean a lot to the other young professionals in this field who are also finding it difficult to work in this field in this moment, right? With so much uncertainty. And I mean, it is also a call to step up and keep the work moving forward. Anyways, thank you both for your answers. And listeners, you'll know that I usually don't weigh in on the questions myself, but in the spirit of Earth Day, I'm going to make an exception. And I want to pick up on this thread of participation because I think that's ultimately what Earth Day is about. It's not just an occasion for those of us who spend our days in the weeds of environmental law and policy. It's an open invitation to people from all walks of life to think about why these issues matter to them personally and to start making those connections between the systemic challenges we've been discussing today and their own lives, communities, and futures. And I think that matters more right now than it perhaps has in a long time. Jordan and Jay both touched on the fact that the triple planetary crisis is fundamentally a democratic and governance challenge, and democracy, by definition, requires participation. And in the same way, NEPA and all of these other environmental statutes and processes that we've discussed today also require participation. They require people to show up, to ask questions, and to demand accountability. Environmental law doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists because people, starting with that first generation 56 years ago, decided that clean air, clean water, and a livable planet were worth fighting for. So regardless of who you are, Earth Day is your day too. The work that ELI and organizations like it do is ultimately in that service. And the most powerful thing any of us can do is stay engaged, stay curious, and refuse to let these issues feel too big or too technical to be worth caring about. That participation, to me, is the enduring power of Earth Day, and it's absolutely worth protecting.
I love that. I'll share that we're talking about our love of process and systems and all of this stuff that does not translate well beyond wonky audiences. And I'll often try and challenge myself by explaining our work to my children who are quite young. And if I can't keep them interested for more than 10 seconds, you have to try again. You have not hit your mark. This goes back to the question of why are we doing this and what are our goals? If you can't get to the heart of why you're doing this work, then why are you doing it, right? Really just getting back to a grade school explanation of why we do this work. That has to be our starting point. That has to be our end point. And Earth Day is a great time to bring us back to that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much again for joining me today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you, Sebastian.
And that's all for today's episode of People, Places, Planet. A huge thank you to Jordan Diamond and Jay Austin for joining me to mark Earth Day 2026 with such a thoughtful and wide-ranging conversation that I think captures both the weight of this moment and the very real reasons for hope. And if today's episode resonated with you, you can share it with a colleague, a friend, or in the spirit of Earth Day, anyone who you think might be interested in learning more. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to People, Places, Planet, wherever you get your podcast. It goes a long way in helping us reach new listeners and keeping these conversations going. We'll also have links in the episode description, so be sure to check those out if you want to dig deeper into anything we covered today. Until next time, I'm Sebastian Duque Rios. Thanks for listening and happy Earth Day.
Thanks for listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, attend one of our events, or support our work financially, head to eli.org.